Ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends of the OR Tambo School of Leadership, good evening and welcome to yet another episode of Tintswalo's Perspective. This is a platform where we engage with young people from various sectors of society around a variety of issues of national concern. And this is where we showcase the work that has been done by these young people in playing their active role in transforming society. You know that this is our Wednesday evening church, and this is our 12th episode. And today we'll be having a discussion that is really close to my heart. The discussion is around the issues of transformation in the higher education and training sector. We know that that is a very important sector in our society because it determines a lot of socio-economic matters that have to do with the development of this country. But beyond that, it's a space of knowledge and skills production, which are very central to the development of this country. So today, joining me to assist me have this conversation and talk about the path of transformation within that sector. I'm joined by Julia Mtsweni, as well as Tarik Lalla, that I'm about to bring on the platform so that we can have a conversation.
Hey, but I can't hear you. I'm not sure what's wrong.
Oh, you can't hear me. Oh, but I can hear you. We can hear you. I don't know why you can't hear me. Terry, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
You can't hear Tarik as well, eh? Okay, we'll fix that on the side. We'll fix that on the side. We'll fix it on the side during the conversation. We'll fix that here on the side so that we can fix that issue. So, are you able to hear us now? Okay, lovely. So, as I said, today we're joined by comrades Tarik Lal as well as Julia Mtsweni to discuss transformation in the higher education and training sector. So without wasting any time, I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves. And I'll start with comrade Julia to introduce herself. In your introduction, please tell us about your activism journey and what is it that you're currently involved in so that our guests can get to know you. And so that when you drop those bars, they don't say, but who's this one?
Yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Julia Mtsweni. So I'm a young female woman who is a student activist. So my journey started at the University of Venda in Limpopo, where I first got my membership from one of my own mentors. He's a former SRC president called Fuki. So that's where my activism started. But for me, for my activism to actually kickstart was how women were not perceived to be leaders back then. So that's when I started getting into SASCO and being an activist. Then I moved on to leading my region in SASCO in Limpopo, leading my province as a former provincial treasurer. Then I became in the working committee of SASCO, and right now, presently, I'm the deputy president of SASCO. I sit in the international committee, which has given me the opportunity to travel the world to learn how things are done internationally, so we can benchmark and come back home with those ideas so that we can transform where we lack so that we can also better our own country. So in a nutshell, that's who I am, and that's what I stand for.
Oh, thank you very much, Julia. I'm almost tempted to ask, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
I'm not allowed to remember right now. I see you.
Commentary, please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about your background and your activism journey.
No, thank you, Comrade Kefense. Comrade DP, it's very good to see you. Yeah, my name is Comrade Tarik Lalla. I'm a SASCO member, a member of the broader Progressive Youth Alliance. I've served 2 terms in the SRC at the University of Pretoria. So my activism journey started at the University of Pretoria. I served as the General Secretary of the SRC at that institution. I've served in various leaders also within the PYA and in a number of societies on campus, including as the ANC Youth League resource mobilizer. So I do have a good couple of years at the university fighting the institution for purposes of ensuring students have access. So at the moment, I'm currently, well, part of the hashtag Let Lalla Learn campaign. It's something that we've started because the University of Pretoria, what we've seen recently is the emergence of like this agenda to depoliticize the space. And part of what they've done is basically to ensure that former student leaders, sort of prominent student leaders, people who speak out against the institution, face repercussions for calling out the institution. So at the moment, I'm not registered. Although I am admitted to the degree, I'm not registered. And so a number of student activists, student organizations, obviously led by the Progressive Youth Alliance, have sort of built this campaign now that we're working on to put pressure on the university to end student victimization at a broader level. And I think also advances the idea of like broader systemic change. But I mean, yeah, I'm in the presence of leadership here, so I shouldn't speak too long. Yes.
All right. No, thanks for that. It's clear that I have the right people who are actually in the thick of things. And what we're going to be discussing today would also be, laced with some personal experience, which is important because then it gets to bring the cracks of the matters to the fore so that we can understand what are the challenges and what are the developments in terms of transforming that particular sector. I hope you're passing, Comrade Land. Comrades tend to stay too long without progressing. I hope you're a different case. So let's get to it. The higher education sector, obviously, we moved from apartheid into 1994, where there's democracy, and we know that a majority of our people, the Blacks and Africans in particular, were denied access to some of these institutions of higher education and training, right? But going into 1994, we start seeing the doors of learning opening up. But of course, that opening up also has its challenges as time goes, and you start seeing, various generations fighting against fees to fall, fighting against academic exclusions, financial exclusions, institutional racism, and many other issues that we can speak about. But I think that the first thing that we should do is to maybe give a layout of where we are in terms of that particular sector and as far as transformation is concerned at this point in time. And I'll start with Comrade Julian.
But look, we must appreciate that we have come from a very, very long path. When you transform something, it has to have a facade where it looks completely different from where something was initially. So transformation for me is a series of events where things change time from time, where we see something completely new. Yes, we do agree that post 1994, with the introduction of the Green Paper in 1996, I think, then the White Paper in 1997, policies were implemented to make things different, because transformation is actually a process where when a certain generation fights for something, it is the next generation that has to now inherit that transformation and move on with it to the next generation. You've said it, Fees Must Fall was a stage when then it took us to our activism of fighting for fees to fall. They have not fallen, by the way. It's one of the challenges that we still have. So transformation sometimes has got its advantages and disadvantages. Now, from where I'm seated, and I will tell you, is that there are wins and there are some battles that we're still fighting. I'll use for one example, social transformation in our Institute of Higher Learning, our funding modules in our Institute of Higher Learning. We have one of the biggest issues with transformation on the funding module would be we still have this two-tier between the universities and the TVET sector. Now, for a practical, for example, is that with NSFAS, we always had this battle where university students, we would always have to go protest and strike Now, the TV sector, if you've paid attention, the funding model is working because we had fought a battle to say funding has to go directly to the student. Why do we have this middle people? Why must we pay through universities? Imali, a student must come from NSFAS directly to the owner, which is a student. The TV sector has actually adopted this. Hence, you see that there's a bit of silence, but the university still, the rollout pen is going out. So I would say, look, with transformation currently, yes, there's access, but is it still free for everyone? No. Yes, there is access, but are students in a well constructive environment? Has the curriculum been better for students? In some sense, I would say yes or no, because in some universities now, a young Black person can learn isiZulu. Before, that was not allowed. So there is transformation there and there. Like, look, transformation started with access. Now we are in within the system, but the system somehow, some institutions try to make it out that these Black young people, even though they still have that access, they must still suffer. They must still have it difficult for them to graduate. That's why you find the racism. That's why you find the funding modules that made it difficult for young people to study, in particular the Black class or the working class. So in this discussion, perhaps we need to still look on to say, it is it's free or is it not free? We have the access, but to what extent? You may put me through a door of a campus, but am I going to be able to afford that education? Hence, we see the dropout rates. They're skyrocket now. So perhaps from this discussion, we will have to touch on the challenges apart from the gains. Yes, the gains are appreciated, but the challenges, how do we tackle those challenges as young people, in particular as Tintswalos?
Thank you so much, DP, for laying that ground. I'll call her DP because she's the deputy president of SASCO. It's part of our jargon, so please don't kill me. I'll refer to that as DP. Commentary. Obviously, the DP has given us some sort of a teaser, if I may say, of what are the gains and challenges that are still experienced. What is your own perspective in as far as transformation in that particular sector is concerned at this current point in time?
Yeah, Comrade, I fully agree with I think the outline that Comrade DP had provided, and I think for me the to provide some sort of pretext to what I'm going to say, I think the biggest mistake anyone who's speaking about like higher education or any transformation for that matter can make is to think that it's binary. Either a system is untransformed or it's transformed. I think we have extensive understanding as young people in this country that transformation is a process, and so in as much as we've seen significant gains, we've seen significant progress, it doesn't mean that we exist within a fully transformed higher education system. Nor do we exist, I think, within higher education institutions that are fully transformed. And so I think there's like, for me, the way that I tend to perceive it is there's like sort of big, broad areas that we need to speak about. The first is obviously economics, right? We understand, I think, that race has always been closely linked to class within South Africa. That's exactly what the apartheid system did. It ensured that race and class are effectively, at least functionally, interchangeable. And I think we ask ourselves, okay, we've made huge amounts of progress ensuring that working class students can access universities. And I think we have to celebrate that as a victory. I mean, NSFAS funds just under 1 million students today. We can't pretend that is not a victory. But at the same time, we understand that NSFAS, number one, how sustainable is it? Number two, how do we fix out the challenges that NSFAS faces? Do we speak about issues of direct payment versus or paying the institution which then pays students? We understand that there are challenges even within the progress that we've seen, you know. And at the same time, Comrade DP also mentioned issues or social and political issues within or challenges within our institutions of higher learning. One of them is curriculum transformation. I mean, we still understand that academia has historically been set up to serve particular interests, as is any sort of sector of society. It emanates from a sort of, societal vision. And for a long time, people of color, people of the working class didn't contribute to that vision. So we understand that academia in itself, in its nature, is exclusionary. So how do we transform the knowledge that has existed? How do we incorporate existing knowledge systems that have been kept out of institutions for very long? And that's sort of the second and third broad areas, is the sort of social and political challenges and victories that we've made. I mean, there is at the moment discussion, and I stand to be corrected on allow or sort of ensuring that institutions become multilingual institutions. And that's especially something that we need to see in historically white institutions, where we've only had English and previously Afrikaans as the sort of means of education. So and I think the last one that I speak to is also somewhat economic in nature, is the idea of like the services that exist for students. Do we have enough of a safety net for students when they are facing challenges, for them to ensure that those challenges are addressed? When it comes to finances, when it comes to physical and mental health, when it comes to academics, do we have that safety net that exists? And I think we've seen huge progress within institutions, and obviously varies per institution because of institutional autonomy. Certain universities have been able to invest in certain things, whereas other institutions have invested in others. And I think that's something that we can maybe unpack a bit later, is institutional autonomy and how effective it is in ensuring that there's that sort of broad-based progress. But like I said, we understand that progress is not binary, and we understand that we've seen huge progress in ensuring access and the opportunity to strive, but we also understand that institutions are not completely transformed. And it's very often the case that the systems, unless challenged, will remain the systems that our parents and grandparents were fighting for decades ago.
So what I'm getting from both of you is that there has been progress that has been made, but obviously there have been some setbacks and areas of progress that needs to still be explored. And one of the things that I think I would like to touch on that came out in your inputs. One is the disparities that exist, one between universities and TVET colleges.
Yeah.
I think touched on that a bit, but also Tarik touches on the disparities that exist between, predominantly white institutions and predominantly Black institutions, right? And my question is, how do we begin to bridge those gaps? And then the other thing that I would like us to also talk about is the question of access in itself, to say, yes, of course, the doors of learning have gradually opened, right? But there's still more that needs to be done. And particularly when you look at the disparities that exist between Blacks and Africans versus white, white people, where on the one hand you have the white people, progressing very well and their illiteracy rates being very low. But on the other hand, when you come to the Blacks and Africans, illiteracy rates are still very high, dropout rates are still very high. So how do we start bridging those gaps? One, the gap between TVET colleges and universities. Secondly, the gap between predominantly white institutions and Black institutions. And thirdly, how do we widen access such that we can bridge this disparity that exists between, races in terms of educational outputs and literacy rates?
Okay, let me take the TVET and university disparity. The reason why I would want to touch on this topic is that, when you travel, my fellow friends, you tend to see a lot and you tend to learn a lot. So in Europe, the most popular, not popular, but one sector that's given so much attention is actually the TVET sector. But in this instance, then they'll call it your colleges or your vocational colleges, because they appreciate the fact that that is where skill is taught, something to give a young person an immediate job, carpentry, plumbing, electrician. Now, you come to Africa, these jobs, people downplay them, they downlook them. But if you go to a shop, you need a chair, you need a table. Guys, your sink always blocks now and then. You need a plumber. 3 times in a year or 4 times, you need a plumber. You understand? Simple things like autism, you understand, electricians, you need this, you need the skill. Now, I have this very unpopular opinion that to make this TVET sector quite popular, let's say, for example, we learn theory in our universities and we move the practicals to the TVET sector. Now, in this instance, I would say, let's say, for example, a doctor, someone training to be a doctor, will learn the theory part in a university-based foundation. Then when it's time to do practicals, I don't know how doctors do everything, guys. I'm sorry, you'll stand to correct me. It's just an example that I'm trying to give everyone. After you've done your theory, you go to the TVET sector, what we will call a TVET sector. Then we will see a balance in some case. Second to that, our government needs to take care of our TVET sector. The infrastructure is still horrible. You would go to, for example, some of our TVETs in Limpopo or Mpumalanga or whatever in our more rural provinces. The TVETs there are neglected, but there are students who would want to study. Now, for something to be attractive, guys, it has to look attractive. You go to a TVET sector, it does not even look attractive. No one in the right mind would want to go study there. So I think second, it would be that. And number three, it would be the fair share between universities and TVET sector students. Now, you would get that the NSFAS would give a TVET student, let's say, for example, 10 Rand, but give a university student 15 Rand. But when both these students go to a shop, they won't say, are you from a university or TVET? So we will give you a discount because you're from a TVET, and then we will give university students the normal price because they're from a university. Everything needs to be balanced. These are books, these are your book allowances, your accommodation allowances. Now, last to that, which goes back to infrastructure, TVET students don't have accommodation. So now when I'm a Julia, I'm from Mpumalanga or Limpopo or whatever the case, and there's a TVET I've seen and I see that this TVET is quite good. By the way, Northwest got one of the best TVETs. Now, I want to study in this TVET, but there's no accommodation in this campus. I don't want to live off campus where I study because of the crime rate in my country. I'm a young female. It already becomes so unattractive to me. So those are these are like four key factors why universities, TVET sector has not become so attractive. I'm not sure what is the delay in implementing either of these problems because TVET students need accommodation. You understand? TVET students, they need a fair share of allowances, whether they're in a TVET or university. It has created this elitism. We have created also this elitism in universities that if you are from a university, you have seen better than a TVET student. Perhaps government, when they start taking job applications or taking appointees, they should try perhaps to make it fair share that let's allow the TVET students also to be incorporated into government so that when we look at people's CVs, we don't just see University of Pretoria or Johannesburg. Perhaps we need to see graduates from some TVETs. It becomes attractive because also where I'm standing, I would not want to, let's say, risk not getting a job because government has made it so elitist that only university students will get jobs. What about the TVET sector? And also I'm not sure how I would want to put this, but perhaps create more opportunities for young people who are from the TVET sector so that it can be seen that actually we do need more electricians, we do need more plumbers, we do need more carpenters. A young person who's got the skill can have their own shop where they make their own furniture and sell it to people. Perhaps we need to popularize this part as well. So for my take, that is what I actually wanted to put on the table based on this two-tier system, because when you travel, you will see how popular colleges are abroad. Their foundations, their infrastructure, everything. Actually, I get so jealous on how superior their colleges are. When you come back home and you speak of a student from a TVET sector, we have this elitist mentality. And I think it has to start with us. we need to denuclearize our mindset of always assuming that the TVET sector or students from TVET sectors are lesser of students or are lesser equipped to be part of the economy, because they play a fundamental role actually in the economy as well. I think let me pause there and give the other topic opportunity to Tarik.
No, thank you so much, DP. And you raise a very important question. One, the need to reorientate ourselves on the importance of the TVET sector, right? And I think for me, attached to that, before we go to Tarik to answer some of the questions, just to share my thoughts as well, is when this whole thing of TVET must rise, became a thing, I think around 2016, 17. One of the things that we argued was that you also need to create an incentive for businesses to actually go into TVET colleges and invest, right? So it's not just a task of government, but why would you have, for example, a career expo in a university with mining companies, manufacturing companies present, but in TVET colleges there's barely those things, right? Where actually these companies are invested. But when you go to university, you will find that there is, a example, an FNB building at Wits, which was actually invested by FNB so that it can be able to get whatever skilled people that it needs from that university, right? So that's why then when you are an accountant, or yes, you're an accountant or you're in the finance at Wits and you entered, you went to FNB building at some point. When you go out of Wits immediately, FNB is probably one of the companies waiting for you at that exit door, right?
Yeah, they headhunt
Because
you.
they have actually invested in your education. But secondly, I think it also goes to this question of lack of clarity in terms of our industrial policy. Because for me, when you speak about industrial policy, it has to be linked with the educational outputs, right? And that's why there's this whole notion of saying, seemingly the qualifications that young people are taking up are not matched with market requirements. And I'd say that argument, in as much as it's sound, but it's insufficient. I'd rather say that the educational outputs are not linked with the developmental objectives, because then that is far greater than what the market demands, but it speaks more to what the country demands. And I would like to see a sort of alignment in terms of our educational policy as well as our developmental trajectory, particularly the industrial policy, because the industrial policy must empower the TVET college space, right? It must be able to even make requirements to say, if there is a manufacturing company in the steels industry, we expect you to invest a certain percentage of your revenues in building TVET colleges or investing in them so that you can train people in whatever skills that is required in that particular industry. We can go to mining, we can go to farming, because really TVET colleges, as you said, have to speak about skills development, where else universities speak more about theoretical development, and this is your academia space. And another thing I think that you said that's important, being able to delineate the two. Theoreticians must go to university, and TVET must really be a space where you work with heads. So you can't have someone doing business administration at a TVET college. That, for me, it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. You can't have someone doing public administration at a TVET college, right? Then we need to work with hands. And attached to that is that once we do that, we must also invest in the right equipment, because part of the struggle is that, as you said, that infrastructural deficit also goes to the type of equipment that people are trained with. So once we are able to delineate between academia as a theoretician space and the TVET as a skills development, then we can even start investing the right equipment. And this is not just the role of government, but there has to be a social compact that is built with business as well, in as far as making sure that TVETs must rise. So I just wanted to add that, and our guests that are joining us live, you're welcome to ask questions. We'll post them there. So now I'll go to Tarik to answer, those two questions. How do we bridge the gap between predominantly white institutions versus predominantly black institutions? But also, how do we broaden access in such a way that we can start dealing with the disparities that exist in terms of literacy rates, in terms of race, the blacks versus the whites?
No, thank you, comrade. Look, I think it's incredibly telling that what Comrade Julia mentioned in relation to TVET colleges is also something that we can speak about in relation to sort of the discussion that we need to have around historically black and historically white institutions. And the reason I say that is because I think it's the same broad system that we need to be able to change. So what I'm trying to say is, like, for me, the first step in trying to ensure that the transformation and the progress we've seen up to now is to challenge the way that institutions of higher learning function. For example, we understand, like, institutional autonomy is something that is very prevalent. It's something, the idea that an institution, the university of this place, can outcompete another university. But we shouldn't be perceiving education as like a product. It's not a product. It's a mechanism to alleviate social injustice and a mechanism to empower people. And I think, for me, when we speak about the discussion that we're having about the discrepancies between historically black and historically white universities, the first step would be to understand and to sort of reposition the higher education sector in such a way that we understand that institutions don't exist for themselves. Institutions exist for the broad populace, which is to say all students in this country, and to sort of do away with this idea that institution X must attract more students than institution Y. And the reason I said is because when Comrade Julia spoke about TVET colleges, I also think one of the things that contributes to it, and sort of the way we perceive TVET colleges versus universities, is the idea that universities are much bigger institutions. In the sense that they have much bigger budgets, they have much bigger access, much bigger reach, and much bigger control of where sector invests its funds. And the reason they've done that is because institutions of higher learning that are universities are historically more empowered than TVET colleges. And that's what I'm saying is that once we begin to understand that a university doesn't exist as an island, but as a broader system of higher education, what we can then do is we can then start speaking to what you said, Comrade Cliffens, is the idea of, like, how do we match the educational outputs to the developmental objectives and industry policy. We can't do that for as long as institutions of higher learnings are the sort of vanguard of education. We need to have the Department of Higher Education being the sort of institution, ensuring that education is not sort of commercialized. And I think that's something that's speaking to now the discussion specifically around historically black and historically white institutions, is that historically white institutions have exactly that, historically been much more powerful. They've always had access to creative funds. They've always had access to private sector. They've always had access to resources. Now, we can't sort of throw institutions that were historically black and institutions that were historically white into the same system and say, no, they compete. Because we understand that historically white universities do have an advantage. Once we take away the idea that an institution must exist for itself, we can then do away with the discrepancy and understand that we need to standardize education, and that you don't have a department within one university that's teaching exactly the same degree but has a much better curriculum than the department in another university. So that's what I'm trying to speak to, is like the idea of ensuring that education is not commercialized, it does not become a product, but understanding that in the same way you don't allow water to be allocated by private sector or by certain institutions, public or private. We say that the Department of Water must be in charge of ensuring that people have access to water, or Department of Housing must ensure that people have access to housing. we must ensure that the Department of Higher Education and Training must be in charge of ensuring that people have access to higher education. Because once we start seeing it as a basic need, we're no longer having conversations about private sector dictating to the state where graduates are needed, where graduates are not needed. And subsequently, we also do away with the historical advantage that historically white universities have had when it comes to access to funds and resources and so on and so forth. The other thing I think, just briefly to speak to, is the fact that, we also understand that higher education, just like any other sector, is a manifestation of society. So we understand that sort of how people perceive TVET colleges and historically black universities is lower than how people perceive having a degree from, University of Pretoria, UJ, FITS, UCT, and UKZN. And that has to do with the fact that we need to then challenge as a collective, within the student body, what it means to get an education, right? Is the education worth the piece of paper that you get, or is the education worth the ideas and the knowledge that you can take away and actually implement to better your and your families, your community, and the country's, broader standard of living and so on. So I think that that point of institutional autonomy, and I think the last thing is like ensuring that we have like equal access. What do we need to do to have access, or to ensure that there's equitable access? Again, within the context of institutional autonomy, we need to do away with the fact that you have historically white universities that can decide that they need to have a higher registration fee or a higher application fee. There needs to be a standardized process for ensuring that we have equal access to all universities. And the only way we do that is through a coordinated effort. And I think, change doesn't happen by chance. We aren't where we are because things happened. There were deliberate decisions that needed to be made. And in the same way that those decisions were made, we need to make deliberate decisions now to say that, access to higher education is not a privilege. It shouldn't be something that we feel lucky for having. People who are academically deserving should be in higher education, full stop. And once we understand that that is the sort of basis of higher education, not the idea that people must have access because they have access to increased resources or sort of have a historical advantage. Once you understand that every academically deserving person must have access, we're having a very different conversation about what is the role of a TVET college, what is the role of a university, because we're no longer looking at it from the perspective of a product, but as a basic need. So, I do hope I answered the question. I know I sort of went off a bit there, but yeah, I submit.
No, I think you raise an important question. The fact that educational institutions and training institutions should be seen as a microcosm of society, rather than institutions that exist for the sake of existing. They exist to serve society. And in South Africa, like in the case in Brazil and many other developing countries, it's interesting that when you get into the higher education and training space, people tend to converge in public institutions. In fact, the outputs of public institutions of higher education and training are more valued, than actually the outputs of basic education and training institutions. So you have a phenomenon where people who choose to go to private schools during their basic education, but they will all converge towards public institutions. And I think what you just said then becomes relevant, because at the end of the day, these are public institutions, right? And they exist to serve the public, they exist to serve society. And I think also, it ties well with what I said, that needs to be linked with the developmental objectives, right?
Yes.
Because that's where you can have a standardization.
Yes.
You can't have a standardization for as long as UCT does its own thing, University of Limpopo does its own thing. So I think that the best way then to have that autonomy and ensure that it's not independence from what the country is trying to achieve is to enforce developmental objectives in terms of the expected outcomes of educational outputs. So now I wanted to touch on another sensitive topic, well, three sensitive topics. One, I think the DP has already spoken a bit about it, but I'd like her to expand, is the question of funding, right? Do we understand the funding streams that go into this sector? And how can we improve those funding streams? And I'm asking this question more broadly because we tend to just focus on NFSAS, but there are other funding streams that we don't talk about, which I think we need to really interrogate so that we have a, average improved funding model of higher education and training sector, across universities and TVET colleges. So the funding question. The second one is the question of accommodation, also a very thorny issue. How do we improve accommodation, right? And the last question that I want to touch on is the question of curriculum, right? I know that you've touched a bit on it. I think it was Comrade Tarik who touched on it a bit. How do we improve the curriculum, right? There has been questions of decolonization that have been brought on the agenda. How far are we in terms of that agenda? What does that look like, right? What is the ultimate goal of having this decolonization, particularly taking into consideration that we are in an age of new information where there is rapidly new things to learn. So how do we conceptualize decolonization and transformation of the curriculum? So those three questions, I would like us to tackle them. You're welcome to ask your questions on Facebook or YouTube. Then we'll be able to share them on the screen and ask our guests. Correct, Julia, you may start first.
Okay, sure. Let's start with funding. Now, before we even start with how do we get funding, different sources, aside from NSFAS, we need to understand that funding, let me put it like this. When a student enters an access university or a TVET or whatever, the student already has got a status on their forehead. The student is either from a struggling background, or now we call them students middle class, and this is your missing middle. You have students who can afford to get their funding. Now, there's so much red tape on how to now classify different students. Those who are from struggling backgrounds who will then depend on NSFAS. Then you'll have your missing middle who, before the new intervention, literally had nothing. Now your missing middle students are students that the policy says this student's family can afford. But when you look at the circumstances, they actually can't really afford. You understand? Then you would have some students who will be forced to getting loans, a loan where they have to perhaps pass certain modules, then pay back a specific percentage. Then, of course, you would have those privileged students who would not depend on any form of funding. Now, who pays for this? I think it goes back to what you would say, that perhaps the private sector also needs to jump in a bit to say that they would enter universities and invest in certain skills. We see it mostly with law firms, where law firms will go into these prestigious universities to say, no, we are investing in young people who are studying this degree. We would see that some of the students will be taken to do their articles in some of these institutions. That's one way, the private sector, of course. Grants, of course, these are international grants. I think in some instances, some countries would want to invest in some skill that they would not have in their own country. South Africa is sleeping on one thing, agriculture. I think we are one country that's got beautiful knowledge under agriculture. We need to invest more in agriculture. And the only way we invest more in agriculture is to make it more attractive to the foreign aid. Now, when this foreign aid invests in a young person, and it goes back to the TVET sector, where else would you learn more about agriculture and all of this? Take it to the TVET sector. When they invest in this one particular skill, it has got more investment. These young people then are taken abroad where they get more exposure and come back and develop into their own communities and enroll more into society and economy. You'll have to mind me. I'm one person, guys. You know, economics is one module that I am not fond of. So you'll have to excuse my jargon around this one particular topic. So for me, I would say the most thing that we have to focus on is foreign investment. That is core. Private sector, second core, because like look, the public sector is actually held by its risk now. More and more and more and more and more people want to study, but the funding is so little. The money is actually literally not there. That's why you see so many protests. That's why you'll see sometimes on a child's application, it says approved for funding, eligible for funding, but you'll get that the payment is late. The payment is late because actually there is no money. So I think from our point of view, we need to get more different streams of income, your foreign aid and your public sector. For me, from my point of view, that is it. Curriculum. Let me touch on curriculum. I think the one thing that we tend to misunderstand about curriculum, we think curriculum is just a book where a young student learns, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer. I have to learn theory one, two, three, or whatever, so on and so forth. Curriculum also is how a young person is taught, the method young people are taught. That is part of curriculum. Now we're in an age, there's everything is digital now. We're in an age where things have to differ now. We're in an age where classrooms have to be a bit different to make the tools of learning a bit easier, where you would not just make a student have paper scripts or that case. In sessions where you would have to make the method of teaching or learning has to be different. Now, you would go to one university where everything is digital. You enter university, everything is so simple to learn. You go to one university where everything is so outdated. Now, these are the kind of things that we also need to work on. Aside from making everything new aged, better, where we were so colonized, we make everything into our own languages. Also, the ways of teaching in our mother tongues. I think in some instances we need to actually also speak about that. I'll give you a practical example. I was doing a presentation in my university, which is the University of Venda, and the lecture kept on using English. Now, this young man is, I think he has a poor grasp of English. So he opted that I am not going to present. And the lecturer then finally said, actually, what language do you want to present in? And he said, I want to present in Chivenda. And he asked, do all of you understand? And luckily for some of us, we can hear. Now, we need to now be honest. Not everyone, when from their high schools, has English as a first medium of instruction. Some people have done isiZulu, isiNdebele, or so and so forth. Now, when they go to universities, then they're thrown into this pit that now everything is in English. Everything that you need to learn on is in English. Now, young people are opting out. They're like, for example, in presenting, that's a fail. So curriculum for me is not just a book, like a book now. We need to stop learning about Karl Marx. We need to start now learning about the new ways of doing things. It's not just about theoretical ways, it's also about method. The method has to be updated. The method has to be accommodative of the different challenges that our students are actually perceived under in our campuses. For me, I think in curriculum we need to focus on that. I'm not sure what was the other point again. My screen just went off. It was curriculum.
It was curricula, it was funding curriculum and then accommodation.
Oh, yes, accommodation. Thank you so much. And I hope our bosses by NSFOS are actually listening to us right now. And our bosses there by higher education are watching this right now.
You
Look,
must share so that they can hear us. Just
you
send them
know,
the link.
Siyabonga. So look, with accommodation, it's quite funny because we met with the new administrator of NSFOS, and we had to speak about accommodation to say, look, there are not enough beds. Young people don't have beds, and some of these campuses are exploiting our students. Now, NSFOS has brought in a new policy, which we support. They're capping on accommodation. Now the capping has got it's got a good concept behind it, where it says no landlord is allowed to charge a student more than a specific amount in rental. For example, let's say no landlord is allowed to charge a student more than 5,000 rand based on this specific kind of dwelling. Now, then you'll get a lot of landlords who said, okay, we won't accredit with you anymore, so we can keep our rentals. It's a challenge. Now, landlords do not care about a student. For them, it's business and it's commercial. Then we said in our meeting, look, if you look into the country, there's so many abandoned buildings where we don't even know who they belong to. Take those buildings, reconvert them, transfer them, and take them under the state and make them accommodation for students. So, of course, there's red tape, and we do understand that. But there are some buildings that are under the state that can be renovated into accommodation for students. Because if you look at the biggest cases that we have, because of landlords refusing to accredit their accommodations under the universities because of this cap, NSFAS now has got a lot of students who are looking for beds, but the beds are not there. The beds are there, but the beds are actually not there because the landlords are refusing to accredit under universities. Now, the danger when a landlord does not get the accreditation, the student is no longer safe. You'll get that there's no Wi-Fi because now they're no longer going through the policies of NSFAS. The student does not even have proper studying facilities like a study hall. The student doesn't have transportation because one of the policies is that within a certain radius, there has to be transportation for the student. Now, all of this is all because landlords have become a bit greedy, or the negotiations between NSFAS and the capping have failed. They need to go back and fix that element because at some point we do need the landlords to accredit, but also to go with under the capping. Second to that, the abandoned buildings were touched on. Perhaps the government can tell us how many buildings are abandoned but are under the state. How many can be converted into student accommodation? And why is this taking so long? It cannot be that when we walk around town in the CBD, we see all these empty buildings. You understand? Why are they not being used for student accommodation? So it cannot always be about profit, even under state, because these students literally are under NSFAS. Now, when a student has got this challenge, what is the first thing the students all do? They have to go to a back room. Safety is gone because there's no security in a back room. But we are desperate. Students want to go and study. So for me, with accommodation, the accommodation crisis, I really think, and it comes from a very genuine point of view. I think our government has not been deliberate on the issue of accommodation because they they literally just think a policy will enforce everyone to go under it. And we have seen the rebellion of these landlords. Tarik will also touch on this as well. I think me and him had a case with landlords in the University of Pretoria. It's everywhere, KwaZulu Natal, Limpopo. It's a crisis. But if you look around, there's so much space. Also, NSFAS, why are they not purchasing buildings? They can purchase buildings and turn them to a NSFAS accommodation site. It becomes a NSFAS accommodation. So we can't always now wait for private landlords to come and rescue us. And also, we'll go back to the investors. The investors in the private sector, perhaps they can invest by purchasing some of these buildings, which are just for, let's say, just for the law students, so that these law students, when they invest in them, in, let's say, for example, UJ, they know that it belongs to this particular private company. Their students are safe, their students have got accommodation, and their students they know that when I am under this particular scholarship or whatever, I know I have access to the university, but also have access to a safe accommodation. These are things that we can discuss for days, but I'm telling you, if the government is not deliberate in it and honest and genuine, this is just talk. from our side, we had this discussion with the administrator. I think even my president spoke lengthily on accommodation. It is not a new thing. It is the one of the most long-standing problems. And I promise you, when a young person does not have safe accommodation, it affects their academic journey, because sometimes they miss academia. They miss school because they can't even go to school. When they're in academia, young people cannot go to classes with so much stress. And I don't understand sometimes our government tends to think that when young people take to the streets and start fighting and protesting on accommodation, they would assume that this problem probably will just escalate to something better, where we'll just accept a cap, or we accept we have to go to back rooms. It's not going to happen like that. They need to be deliberate, and they need to be consensus that to say, hey, we have failed in this point. We need to find better ways of doing it. For me, it would be going to the private sector. The private sector will identify certain skills they will invest in. And when they invest, do not just invest in just paying for the academia, also pay for the accommodation. It has to become a package. Identify state abandoned buildings, focus on that. So that will be my input on accommodation.
Thank you very much, DP. Thank you very much. Tarik, yeah, I'll hear your response, but I just need to ask you guys permission so that we can run up until 7:30, because I think there's still, some more questions that I want to pose, particularly the question of student activism within campuses at this current point, but also the question of technology that you touched on, just to expand a bit on that, with things such as AI now, featuring and becoming a threat and an opportunity to many students, right? So we'll talk about that after Tarik gives us his response. Tarik, please, respond to some of those questions that I posed. If you are covered in China, you know the rule. If you're covered, you're covered.
Yeah. No, Comrade DP, I think, covered a lot of the discussions on funding. The first question that you asked about, like proactive engagement, I think that's the biggest issue that especially like activists on the ground have, is that the nature of the activism is reactive. So something happens and we have to respond, and it means that we never get to a point where we're proactively proposing solutions to challenges that may happen, or we're never in a position to mitigate. And I think, again, Comrade DP spoke at length about the role of the private sector. Look, I think Comrade DP is also being very nice about the situation. My opinion is that private sector has a responsibility. The fact of the matter is that the private sector benefits of graduates. We can't pretend that private sector would exist if public institutions of higher education did not. So this whole like perception that I think a lot of young people have about the private sector being the savior, by giving a handful of degrees here and there, a handful of bursaries. I mean, we look at how much of funding is available that is put forward by the banks, by the law firms, by the science firms, by all of these institutions that are in the private sector, versus how much of knowledge and gain they're extracting out of the system. And I think that's why, it's this discussion of philanthropy versus duty. I don't think that the private sector is doing anywhere near as much as what it needs to be doing, because if it is going to be the biggest employer of graduates, it's going to be the biggest benefactor of the knowledge that people get. They have a responsibility to put back in that system. They cannot rely on NSFAS and the public sector and the state to invest in knowledge generation and development, and then want to employ those people and benefit of the knowledge that those young people get, without understanding that they have a role to play in actually, ensuring that we not just make like a handful of tokenist bursaries available, but actually contribute towards progressive, like broad-based funding models. The second question you had, Comrade, was that of accommodation. I think, again, like Comrade Julia, I knows how many cases I've run to her with about issues of accommodation in Hatfield. It's the fact of the matter is that, simply put, the goal of the private sector, the goal of a business is to make profits, right? And if we understand that, then we can also understand that the goal of private accommodations is not to provide accommodation, but to make money off the accommodation that they're providing. And I think that goes back to the suggestion is that anecdotally speaking, I've had a number of engagements with the big groups that own the majority of buildings. It's like a handful of groups that hold all of the buildings in the University of, or in Hatfield and Prinshof and Groenkloof campuses by UP. The fact of the matter is that there's only so much we can do on the ground until we get to such a point where we understand that there needs to be infrastructure development, there needs to be state-owned accommodations, NSFAS accommodations, and I think at the same time institutional accommodations that needs to be provided. For as long as that's not going to be the case, we're always going to be in the sort of cycle of trying to address issues. Then the accreditation is going to be withdrawn, but these sort of private sector landlords don't really care about accommodation, because what other options do we have as students if they're not going to be accredited from NSFAS? So the reality is that we need to be at the forefront of challenging NSFAS, of challenging the institutions that we exist in, as well as the state, to be developing accommodation, affordable accommodation, because then we understand that the goal of the state is not to make profit like it is with private accommodation. The goal of the state is to provide a service, and that service is going to be accommodation for students. The last thing, and I think it's incredibly relevant to me, and something that I like to speak about, is curriculum development and curriculum transformation. I study science. I should be doing my master's in plant sciences, and one of the things that I've picked up on is how sort of almost arrogantly Eurocentric, so how westernized science is, and specifically biological sciences. We understand curriculum to be how we generate knowledge and how we preserve and teach knowledge, but at the same time we also understand that we have had decades of indigenous knowledge systems in the global south that have been deliberately suppressed in favor of westernized thinking, westernized science, westernized thought processes and processes at large. And we need to be able to transform those knowledge systems, but also incorporate existing knowledge systems. And how do we do that? I think, again, deliberate action. I think one of the biggest mistakes that universities and TVET colleges, more so universities, do is to understand curriculum as a fixed institution. It's fixed. This is what you learn. This is what you must learn. This is what your children are going to learn if this. But we need to be proactive in understanding that curriculum needs to change, and that we need to be deliberate about what we want to incorporate, right? Within plant sciences alone, there is huge knowledge systems within Black African communities, Indian communities, colored communities that have not historically been incorporated into universities' knowledge systems or curriculums. And so what we need to be saying is the way that we drive conversation and curriculum as a product of that conversation is to have student engagement, and I think also community engagement, and not like this tokenist performative community engagement where you have universities going to communities, taking pictures and speaking for the fun of it, but genuine contribution of knowledge that exists within communities to the knowledge and curriculum that people take out of education. And so I think, for example, the one thing that I had is my honors here, we had a module that was about indigenous knowledge systems, but it was worth 5 credits out of a degree that's, 100 and something credits. So it just shows you how much of an afterthought curriculum transformation actually is, versus what effort is needed to bring it to the forefront of the discussion we're having about developing curriculum in such a way that we understand that value doesn't exist because a white man told us that's what's important. Value or knowledge exists because that is how people have understood the world works across communities for centuries. So yeah, I hope that I've captured, and I've tried not to repeat too much. Covered.
No, thank you so much. I think you have elaborated further on what the DP has already spoken about. Just to add my 2 cents here, as I said, this is a discussion that's very close to my heart. Is that I hear that from both of you that in terms of curriculum transformation, we must strive for, pedagogical and ontological and epistemological justice, right? That means what we learn, why we learn it, and how we learn it, right? So being what we learn would be, the ontology of education, but why we learn it would be the epistemology, and then how we learn it would be the pedagogy. How are we taught? For example, the Secretary of the National Youth Service, Dr. Toliga Sibia, has just written a paper where he's arguing that in terms of skills development, we should not just look at it in the formal sense. How do we, incorporate informal learning as part of, learning, recognized learning? For example, there are people who can't access a TVET college or university, but they grew up on a farm and they learn how to farm every day. How do you qualify those skills? How do you move those skills from informal industries into formal industries? And I mean, the Afrikaners are very good with that. If their children grow up in farms, by the time they reach their teenage years, they already know how to farm. And because now they have this property with a guaranteed tenure, they can hand it over to this kid before they even get formal education because they understand how a farm works. So I think it's very important to consider some of those things. In terms of funding, during Christmas Fall, we proposed something, and I think it's still relevant to pursue DP. The question of an endowment fund specific for education. Right? So what you have is you have this pot that is sourcing investment returns from different areas, but those returns are used specifically to assist the funding of education. And once you have that particular endowment fund, you can actually pursue a particular social compact that has to do with improving or transforming the sector. For example, you can have a discussion that says, on the accommodation aspect of things, we want to go into a social compact with the municipality, let's say City of Tshwane, as well as the businesses around, right? And out of this endowment fund, we actually want to buy all of these dilapidated buildings and abandoned buildings that you spoke about. And for example, we want to create a student village around Hatfield. It must be a student village in the formal sense, even in how it's mapped on the map, it must be a student village. Now, once you have that sort of agreement or that sort of compact, you can even go further to the investor and say, since this is a student village and the cost of living for students in this particular village is going to be standardized or reduced to a particular point where they can afford to be here. Why not have 24-hour classes, right? Or if not 24 hours, maybe have a night school where some people don't necessarily need to attend during the day. They can attend at night. And here I'm not speaking about part-time students because it's already happening for part-time. I'm speaking about full-time students who actually can take up some of their classes and assessments at night, because you would have built a student village that is safe, where there is presence of police, securities, cameras, and everything, so that you can also broaden access. Because once you do that, you can imagine if we were taking around 6,000 students for a particular course, if we can say we're actually running a double shift at night and during the day, all of a sudden you can take up 12,000, right, for argument's sake. So you would have broadened access. So I think that's something to pursue, DP. Look into this thing of creating an endowment fund. And I'm raising this because that endowment fund then gives you bargaining power in terms of building these social compacts, right? To say we don't come empty-handed. Here's an endowment fund. We are placing 10 million on the table. What is government placing on the table? They may very well say we're placing 5 million, but in addition to that, we're going to ensure that students, where students live, the municipal rates are going to be reduced as part of subsidization, right? And then all of a sudden, the cost of living in those particular places goes a little bit down. So I think that those are some of the things that you must consider. And finally, I still go back to what I said. For me, transformation of the curriculum is when it's aligned with our developmental objectives, right? So when you say you want massive infrastructure development, does that find expression in the engineering built environment sector within the higher education? Does it find expression? So that when Gifenza qualifies as an engineer, they understand that I have a duty to my country before I have a duty to this employer of mine, right? I have a duty to my country. And even when I'm inside employment, I must raise these questions to say, what are we doing to meet the targets of infrastructure development as part of our corporate social responsibilities? You know, so for me, those are some of the things that we must consider. Now, I'd like to talk about technology, right? AI. I think you spoke about it a bit, DP, when you said we need modern classes with modern technology. Now we see AI is here, and there's been a lot of cases of, plagiarism now with students being victimized that, they use ChatGPT to write their assignments, but this is the reality. And if you think about it, AI is here to make our lives easy, right? All of a sudden, I needed 6 hours to study a particular concept. I can reduce it to two because I can just get through the study guide and then ask AI to give me additional information. And when I cross check, the information is actually sometimes, at par with what is being introduced. So how do we incorporate that in such a way that we empower students in terms instead of victimizing them for using these new tools? But secondly, I also wanted to touch on this question of student activism. I mean, I went to many campuses. I left campus in 2017. Now I go back, through the school to speak to some student activists, particularly those within the MDM, when we try to um, train them on particular skills and particular curricula that we gave at the school. And you realize that there is this dampened student activism, within campuses. The other thing that you realize is there's this militarization and high securitization of campuses where, as soon as students try to voice out what they feel, it's either they are suspended or, there's, private security that rains down on them. And when you look at that experience versus what we had, I mean, we did a lot of things, but post fees must fall. You see this high militarization, securitization, as well as efforts to actually constrain student activism. How are we dealing with that? And then the last question is actually from the Facebook. It's from Peter Mulete. It says, please elaborate more on the 18 months that students need to undergo as interns for them to graduate. It has a negative impact on all those learners who can't access those internship opportunities. They stay with only N6 with the hope that they will graduate one day, at least if the DHE can reduce 18 months to 12 months practical experience to enable students to graduate in numbers. Amanda. So kindly also comment on that. But my initial comment was to say this should form part of that fight that says students must not be required experience, for entry level jobs. Please unmute.
Oh yeah, I think you muted yourself for a moment there. um, so let's first touch on the easier one. I think technology. Look, we touched on this a bit. Technology and 4IR, as you've said it, the AL, it's here. Now, we have seen a lot of students who would use those apps in assignments, and they get failed because it was seen as plagiarism. I think there has to be some form of regulation in some way that students are actually trained to say that, look, guys, this is not here to make everything like for you just to pass, just to copy and paste and pass. It is here as an additional auxiliary tool to assist you so that education does not become this heavy burden where you need to study a book or three books all in. You can't read one book in 2 days. You probably need like 2 weeks or something like that to read three books. But this particular tool will assist you to actually go through this book in less than 4 days. But this is not for you just to copy and paste the information. It's there for you to make your research work and your methodology a bit easier. I think it's perhaps one of our duties as student structures to assist in our campuses to say, look, this is here to assist us. But also universities has to move on with the times, because I'll tell you on my campus, the technology lab capacity is still very primitive. It's a big backward. And a lot of these young people now, what they do is copy and paste, go to the assignments. We don't have Turnitin my campus at the moment because it's something that they have not thought of. Now, when this student graduates and then goes to do an honors at UP, then they face this app called Turn It. Then they're shocked to say, "How? What is this now?" Then they have to go back to the traditional way of doing research and studying. So I think it goes back to the foundations, of course, that our universities have to actually equip and place more capacity on the technological advantages in the universities. Now, the second one that the issue of Peter, I will touch on it a bit after the issue of wait, what was the second one? We touched on technology, and then we have
And
to touch on
student,
the issue of
student
internship.
activism,
Activism.
campus.
Yes, yes. Now, look, I will tell you, there's this one company called security company called Mafoko. I think all of us here have been victims of that company. I will tell you one story. I don't know how I did it, but I saw myself jumping off the highest wall of my life because during protests. Now, what I've discovered is that our universities do not want students to have voices. Our universities and management prefers that they just want to have this building, students, they teach us, we go home, we come back after 3 years, degree. We need to say yes to the conditions. We need to nod to whatever conditions are there. I'll tell you one particular thing that happened to me personally. So the minister came to my campus, and we had this one race. The water was a bit brown. And what we did, we maliciously made this minister go through past that race. And we said, no, 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 can we pass through this race? And we opened the tap water and we said, Vice Chancellor, can you drink this water? And it became a big thing where we were suspended. You know, modules were suppressed. We couldn't register modules. So they have this funny nitty-gritties. And what they do, they just target a few leaders. You know, they'll target a Julia, they'll target an SRC president, and they'll make a grave example out of you. Now they instill this fear in students. Then students tend to, know what, back down and not. That is why when you go into a campus, sometimes when you want to hear the debates in our branches, and I'm talking about our political branches, your YCL, your Youth League, your SASCO, there's this radical nature that we used to know. It's no longer there because of this fear and this threat that management does. So there is this tool that management is trying to inflict in our campuses. I'll tell you another example. I was shocked when we went to one campus, I think it's in Val, during elections. We are told that as outsiders, we're not allowed to enter during their manifestos because we bring the attitudes of other campuses, this unpopular beliefs. I'm thinking, what am I listening to here? So there's a lot of gatekeeping, on activism in our campuses. Now, without activism, you see the high rates of campus crimes, your rapes. A lot of rape is happening in our institution of higher learning. When a young student now, let's say for example, a young girl gets raped and has to go report it management will tell you, go to the police station. You understand? Go and report your case at police station, because a student activist cannot fight. Oh yes, definitely, it's enum nouveau. So there is this gatekeeping on activism, and I think university management has inflicted and has instilled this perception to say that, look, you're a student, you're not allowed to have a voice. And they forget that for us to be where we are today, it was because of people who have lost lives in protests. It was people who lost lives in putting down stones and saying that, look, we are going to march in peaceful protest. We're not even allowed to march peacefully, because the moment they see a great crowd of young people with big ambitions and big opinions and steady, fast thoughts, they get intimidated, because they know that what they've been doing is not it's not what it comes in terms of developing or going forward. So I think we need to go back to remind what some of our vice chancellors, and it's beautiful that half of them, if not in majority, a lot of them are black. It becomes quite a contradiction when you hear a vice chancellor who's a woman or who is black as the person who calls private security on young women or young men. And when this private security starts beating on young people and young men, what is going through their brain? Do they think that for them to be vice chancellors, it would have been possible without a lot of people sacrificing their lives, doing exactly what we're doing today? So, yeah, and I will go back now to faulting myself as a leader. Look, the student movement and a lot of our movements, there's been a lot of challenges, a lot of infights. And when the upper structures are having a lot of infights, it trickles down to our provinces, to our regions, to our branches, where then you'll find that branches are no longer hosting. I was shocked when I went to my own campus. We have this thing called Bua Thursday under YCL, where every Thursday there's a document we have went through and we come back and we discuss. We no longer do that, because people are no longer interested in that. People now are now focusing on who must lead now, who must do this. I want to be elected. The activism and the direction, it has to come from the leaders on top, which is us. Now, when there's so much infighting and so much instabilities, the activism also in our branches, it lacks. A lot of our branches, actually, when you see a lot of activism, it is because they have so much challenges on their own, and they have to now go on autoplane or autopilot and do their own thing. So in another sense, being a leader myself, it will be something for me to say, us also as political leaders or leaders in protest structures, we need to be responsible to say, what kind of branches also are we building in our campuses? Are we building branches to take us to congresses to elect us? Or are we actually creating branches that will put on the progressive ideas that need to go on so that these institutions will not progress if the branches of young leaders in these campuses are also not progressive? That is why you see this vice chancellors, they just walk all over us, because our branches nowadays do not have the capacity. It is not per se their fault. It is because from us on upper structure, what we have been trickling down on these branches, it is not what is needed in these branches. We need to refrain from actually building branches for congresses and actually build branches for progressive thought, progressive development in this institution of higher learning. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, DP. Lulolaeng. O etse tshwantse le re botse you must account. Re tshwantse re le ye bokgoni, le re botse, what are you fighting for? Comrade Tarik, please give us your inputs. I'm looking at the time. I would like for us to end at 7:30. Exactly at 7:30.
Okay. No, thank you, comrade. Yeah, very captured by comrade DP. But I think the one thing I'll say about, like, especially like the use of new tools and so on, is that development has always happened, and it's always been the case of, look, do we use it for progress? Do we use it to benefit us, or do we use it or for negative, right, for bad things? And I think, I mean, AI specifically, I think for us to use it as a tool, we need to be deliberate about how we use it. I think the biggest mistake anyone who is, who has access to AI, or any sort of platform that relates to that, would be to try to reduce it to something that's harmful. And the reason I say this is because I think that, we understand that laptops and technology for a long time was something that we thought, was a mechanism to keep certain people informed and educated, and a mechanism to keep others, uninformed, and to just through access to like technology. And I think in the same way, we need to ask ourselves, look, how do we use AI in such a way that we use it for the benefit? Because I mean, we have some lecturers and modules, and where people are actively using it, and I think if they're being encouraged, if students are being encouraged to use it in a responsible way, we're far more likely to use it for things like plagiarism. If we learn how to use it in order to understand broad concepts or understand content, if we use it to summarize information, that's something that we can use to further our education. And again, goes back to what we were saying earlier. What is the purpose of higher education? Is to get a degree and find employment, or to actually access education? And if we understand higher education as a mechanism of accessing further education, post-matric education, then all of a sudden we start seeing AI as something that we can use. But like we said, we need to, it's something that's very new, and it's something that we need to be able to use responsibly. And yeah, in a way that actually, benefits people. I think the point about student activism is something that I think is very close to something that I speak to now myself as well. Is like, the nature of activism is such that, as students, we don't have much of a choice but to be militant and radical. The reason I say that is because many universities, especially HWS, historically white universities, but all universities, have broad visions and goals that they want to achieve. Now, as students, we've never had the opportunity to contribute to that vision. So we're being asked to buy into a vision that we never contributed to in the first place. And in saying that, the moment that we step out of line, we're considered militant, we're considered radical. And I don't have an issue with those labels, but we understand that the connotations that institutions try to use with the radicalism that we see within student movements is negative connotations. They want to paint us as sort of unreasonable young people who just want to burn everything. When in reality, if we had the platform to actually contribute to discourse in a meaningful way, there was no need for us to go to protest. I mean, post Fees Must Fall, the biggest mistake that universities in South Africa made after Fees Must Fall was to, instead of listen or understanding that the reason that Fees Must Fall happened was because students were not being heard genuinely, they saw it as an opportunity to suppress activism and say to people, look, this is what happens when you give young people an opportunity to have a voice. But you see the framing and the context. And I think for me at the moment, like I said in the beginning, is I'm not registered at the moment, despite being academically and financially eligible. And that's because I've consistently spoken out against the University of Pretoria. I find myself in a position where the activism that so many people before me and myself have sort of committed to is not welcomed and is not brought into confidence and engaged with by the institution, but rather to be sort of treated as something that needs to be opposed. And I'm not unreasonable. Young people are not unreasonable. We, as sort of progressive young people, we're not unreasonable. We are very rational, logical people. So what we've done now is basically found ourselves in a position where the only thing that we can do is start to strike. I mean, start to take to the ground, start to mobilize, start to protest, because that's the only time we're ever heard. And so what we've started doing at the moment is, and I mean, sorry for going over time, but anyone who has Instagram or any sort of social media platform, there is the hashtag Let Lalla Learn. That's something that, like I said, the PYO on campus, SASCO, the YCL, and the Youth League, as well as a number of other progressive student organizations at the University of Pretoria have started. We've sort of worked on this thing, not just to fight against what's happening to me, but to be able to say to institutions, look, number one, we can organize outside of your infrastructure. We can organize as young people. And number two, you're not going to put us in a position where, we are being punished for caring. So that's something that, like I said, there's a petition. If anyone is interested, please, you can find me on Twitter or on Instagram or whatever else. There is a petition. Please sign the petition, and show that, as young people, we have the ability to organize. Because the fact of the matter is that, like we said, instead of listening to our young people had to say after fees must fall, universities decided that our voices no longer mattered. And so, that's exactly what led to fees must fall. And it's almost inevitable that in the next 10 years or 20 years, if you keep treating student voices as irrational people, who don't have some sort of space or role to play in developing and defining what an institution's vision is, we are always going to be in a position where we're being treated and feel like the only mechanism we have is to take to the streets. So, I submit, comrade.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, comrades, for taking your time out of your busy schedules to be with us today and have this discussion. There can never be enough time to discuss this issue. It's a very broad issue. But I was just thinking here, DP, when you spoke about the state of the structure of SASCO, to say, I think also this question of the AI provides us an opportunity to improve our structures. We need to ask ourselves, how do we leverage these technological developments in order to improve structures, in order to enhance student activism? And it's funny that, for example, I went to Wits and got to lead as the SRC president. I got to Wits in 2013. And we used to have things such as town halls, where the VC would come and, would have discussions. And that was an epitome of discourse and therefore nourishing student activism. Because every time we had to go there, we had to prepare what are the issues we want to raise. And I think also another thing that we must keep fighting for, DP, is, an enhanced representation of students in decision making at university levels. I mean, you get to Senate, and these are statutory bodies, you get to Senate, the voice of students is still very, 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 it's almost non-existent. I mean, maybe they would allow 2 members of the SRC to actually be the voice of students out of academics who are in their hundreds in numbers, or tens in their numbers. You go to council, even worse, it's only the president who sits there. FINCO again, So I think we also need to fight for this voice of the students to be heard, more representation. Why can't you have, at least one member of the student council also accompanying the SRC representatives in Senate, so that they can discuss issues from a school level to a faculty level and then to the broad level, including FINCO as well, because these budgets filter down to different schools and departments, right? In council, why can't we have at least 2 or 3 students that are represented there? We can have 1 student from the postgrad, 1 in the undergrad, and then the SRC representative as well. So I think we need to also keep fighting for this enhanced representation, because students are actually the biggest stakeholders and should be the biggest beneficiaries of this educational endeavors and outputs. So with that said, thank you so much, guys, for joining us. And we hope this discussion will not end here, but we'll keep, having these discussions in other spaces. So yeah, thank you so much, DP. Thank you so much, Comrade Tarik. That was the 12th episode of Tintswalo's Perspective, and we had just had a very fruitful discussion on the transformation agenda in the higher education and training sector. I hope you have learned a lot. There's still a lot of challenges. Of course, there are a lot of inroads that have been made, but there's still more to be done. And we need to actually consolidate our voices as students, as members of society, as activists, to actually keep fighting for enhanced transformation in that particular sector, because it's a very important sector, not only for students, but for all of us as a society, because the products that come out of that sector are the ones that should help us develop this country into what we want it to be. So thank you so much. We'll meet next week. Have yourselves a good night. Keep warm until we meet again next week, same time, same place. Have a good night.